Look, Ben, since it's connected, do you want me to run it or do you want to? Okay. Hello, happy Sabbath, everyone. The scripture reading today is Daniel 3, 1 through 15. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?"
Good morning, church. How was everybody this fine day? How was the race this past week?
You're not on.
I can only talk. No, it's on. It's on. Anyways, did everybody have a good week?
Yeah.
We were talking in Sabbath school. Maybe I'll share this one while we're kind of waiting to get started. Maybe it's on now. I can't tell. But we were talking about a race. We talked about a marathon, and life is a marathon, and maybe our spiritual journey is a marathon, isn't it? And, it helps to know, there it is, when the finish line is, doesn't it? I don't know about you. I've never ran a marathon, actually, but I've been in mountain bike races, and Jeff said he swam long distances. It was always good to know when the finish line was, especially the last couple miles in a bike race. Then I could really, pick the pace up for the last couple miles. And maybe it's like that in our spiritual journey. If we knew when the Lord was coming back, would our lives change? Would we kick our spiritual lives into overdrive? Maybe that's the case, but we don't know exactly the day. But What do we do when we're in the middle of a race and we don't know when the finish line is and we kind of lose a little motivation? What can we do to, revive that motivation? I don't know if I have the best answer for you right now. Maybe you can think about that on your own, because there's all moments on the journey when we're just kind of floating along. Maybe we lose some inspiration or some fire. Maybe you're like that right now. Maybe you're on fire right now. I don't know. But we all need revival and reformation during our walks, don't we? I believe so. And I'm thankful for Andrew's song this morning that you shared with us. That was awesome. I'm no judger of music, but I say that was pretty good. But I would say Jeff's prayer was awesome too. Just the same. And but I did write a couple. I was thinking more. Maybe I wrote down a couple things from the beginning of the song there, Andrew, and it says creation sings your praises. I heard that one. And then it says the stars were made to worship. Did I get that right? There's much more than that, but those are the first two I wrote down anyways, and definitely ties into our theme today of worship. And what does worship mean? What is worship to you? So let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for this day. It's a Sabbath day, Lord, a day that you made for us to come into worship. And we're here to worship together today as we lift up your name and praise. We thank you for your creation. Yep, as Jeff said, it's a little chilly outside. We're looking forward to spring, but we know spring has never failed, and you have never failed as well. So we thank you for that, and we praise you. Please bless our time together as we spend in your word, as we sing praises, as we worship you in the name of Jesus. Amen. So again, worship. What does worship mean to you? What does it look like to you? Did you come to church today? Or did you come to worship? Or did you come to church to worship? Hopefully it's the both, but maybe you could be here for another reason. Maybe you're forced to come here. Maybe it's just kind of part of your routine, and maybe you're not totally connected. Maybe you are. I hope that you are here to worship. So we're going to talk about worship for a few minutes here before we get into Daniel chapter 3, because Daniel chapter 3 is all about worship when you get down to it. So where does the word worship come from? It comes from an old English word. It looks something just like that in the middle. It's made up of two words, worth and ship. So words ending with what has the ending ship, such as friendship and fellowship and relationship, means it's a state or quality or condition. Okay, are we in a state of friendship? I hope so. Are we in a state of fellowship? Are we in that condition? I pray that we are. And so worship then pronounced, well, let me start back up. Worthship, which today we pronounce as worship, essentially means, it expresses a condition, quality, or a state of worth. That's what the word means. And that's found in the object of one's devotion, the object of our worship, right? A state of worth. So in its most simplest terms, to worship means to give worth to something or somebody. We can give worth to different things, can't we? You can state it like that. I kept thinking about it. Worship is to declare or hold up something or somebody as worthy. But the more I kind of dug into this idea of worship, it's a huge concept. And there's quite a bit that goes into worship. There are multiple terms in the Old Testament and the New Testament that have been translated as worship, or they are related to the concept of worship, such as serving, bowing down, reading the word, faith, trust, prayer, praise, as we sang music today, confession, obedience, hope. I mean, there's so many more, and it came up in Sabbath school again. How about your tithe and offering? Is that worship? Notice right there in your bulletin, it doesn't say tithe, but it says, yes, it says worship in giving. So is giving really worship? What is worship? Okay, but it's our response to God for who He is and what He has done, and many more things. We're giving God His worth when we worship. Amen? I like the verse in Romans chapter 12:1. I don't know if you got to that one yet there, Tucker, in Romans. Did you get to Romans 12 yet? I know you're close. So therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. So presenting yourself, right, your body holy unto the Lord, is in essence, it is worship, isn't it? Okay, and we could be talking about health, and a lot of times with our health message, we'll go to this verse, but it could be just in general as far as giving your life, giving your whole being to God. That is your spiritual service of worship. Worship is many things. What makes something or somebody worthy? Well, I guess that depends on the nature of that something or someone and the value that we put on it. And that can vary. We say things like, it's a worthy cause, don't we? It's a worthy cause. What's a worthy cause to you? Claudia, what's been on her mind lately is trying to help people dig wells in other parts of the world, but they can't get they can't get fresh water. Is that a worthy cause? Yeah, it's a worthy cause. Or we say things like, it's worth it to me, right? To spend that money or to spend that time, right? It's worth it to me to buy something higher quality if it's going to last longer. That's worth it to me. You know, a car we sell is worth a certain amount, right? And all of these statements here are subjective, aren't they, to the individual? I like my minivan that I had. That was worth a lot to me, but to Claudia, that was low on her totem pole, but that's okay. That's okay. So, of course, we're in church today, so we're going to say that God is worthy, right? I hope we say that. I hope we say that outside of church. There was a gentleman by the name of Carl Jung back in the 1800s, 1900s, Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. I don't know if he was a believer so much. I didn't really dig that much into it, but he didn't seem to be opposed to God like others in the same field as him. But I think we all can connect with what he says here. He says, in essence, whatever sits atop your pinnacle of value system is functionally equivalent to God, to you. All right, so anything that's in your life that's at the pinnacle of your value system, if it's not God, is in essence your God. Or as we often say, it's an idol. Something that we worship, something that we put before God. And I don't know if you have any ideas. It could be work. It could be hobbies. It could be games. It could be people. How do we show value in those things? That's what I wrote down. By the time and the energy that we put into those things, that's at the top of our value system. We may not say that it's an idol, but our actions show that essentially it is, if it's on your priority list. Right? Worship is active also. It's not passive, meaning it's something that we do actively. We're here today worshiping. Right? We can say that we believe and worship the God of heaven, but if our actions do not follow that confession, then we are not giving God his due worth. So what makes God worthy of our worship? What's the basis for it? I think, Andrew, essentially in that song, you said what the basis of that was. What does the Bible tell us? Revelation chapter 4, verse 11, worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were created. Maybe they sang those similar words in that song. So what makes God worthy? It's the fact that he is the creator of all things. Therefore, he alone is worthy of worship. And then he is to be placed at the pinnacle of our value system. And when we do that, he becomes the foundation of everything that we do. And somebody brought up the example of even at work. If God is at the pinnacle of our value system, it will reflect in the way we work and how we interact with people, because God has become the foundation of your life. If he's not at the pinnacle, then he will not be at the foundation of your life as well, and then we will act contrary to his principles. So God is our creator. That's what makes him worthy, and the only one worthy of worship. Nothing created is to be held up as worthy of worship. In Romans chapter 1, maybe a long time ago in your series there, Paul calls out those who worship the created things, and they're without excuse. God is there, and God is evident in all things. So because of creator, then I like the verse in Revelation 5:12, worthy is the Lamb who was slain, right? The Son of God, the Son of Man, the one who can represent both heaven and earth, right? He is the Lamb who was slain. He is our Redeemer also, isn't he? I mean, God has many titles. Christ does. He's our Lord. He's our King. He is our friend. All of these things declare that he is worthy, and the only one worthy of our complete devotion, respect, and adoration. A couple more verses here. John chapter 4, 23 through 24, right, the basis of worship. But an hour is coming. This is when Jesus was speaking to the woman at the well. And he said to her eventually, he says, but an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. All right, this is the basis of worship. God being our creator, but then also worshiping in spirit and truth. Spirit meaning being led by the Spirit. Right, it's not just about form and ceremony. Sometimes church can just turn into form and ceremony, can it? Okay, it needs to be Spirit-led. We need to worship in truth, not according to the dictates of our own hearts, which is a good concept in the foundation of our country, right? We should worship according to the dictates of our own heart, but we need to worship in spirit and truth. If our heart is not in line with the revelation of God's will, as we find in his word, then we're not worshiping in truth. God alone is truth, and we find that in his word. True, heartfelt, lasting worship comes from what has been stirred from within, not stimulated from without. Do you connect with this? Something that's stirred from within. True worship comes from within, not just stimulated from without. And, hopefully I say this correctly, but in our age, the experience of audio-visual, this is the age we live in. Audio-visual, in the moment, often leads to someone having a euphoric feeling of worship, but that state of worship doesn't always last. It dissipates before too long, right? But don't get me wrong, though. At the same time, audio and visual can be a major part of worship. Right? We sing praises to the Lord today, but it should come in response to a converted heart. But then again, at the same time, as I think about it, audiovisual can be an effective ministry in preaching God's word, because those lyrics have meanings. So as long as they're preaching God's word and they're leading people to Christ, then audiovisual can be used in ministry as well. What it comes down to ultimately is, the acceptable form of audiovisual. That's very subjective. We're not going to get into that today, but true, heartfelt, lasting worship comes from what God has stirred within us and changed our hearts, and then, right, it manifests itself, right, in certain forms of worship and just how we act and live. Last verse before we read Daniel 3, the rest of Daniel 3, Nehemiah chapter 3, 1 through 3, it says, now on the 24th day of this month, this was during the days of Nehemiah, the reconstruction of the walls. God's people they needed some revival. They needed some revival, and the Lord worked through Nehemiah in bringing that. But eventually, everybody came together. It says, now on the 24th day of this month, the sons of Israel assembled with fasting in sackcloth and with dirt upon them, just showing their humbleness and humility. The descendants of Israel separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. While they stood in their place, they read from the book of the law of the Lord your God for a fourth of the day. And for another fourth, they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. I just love this. He says something similar in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 1 through 3. It says they assembled as one man, just speaking of mankind, every woman every man, every woman, and anybody that could understand, they were gathered together as one person, you could say. Would you call this worship? Is there a certain portion of that that's worship and not? Or is it all connected to worship? All of it's connected to worship, giving God His worth. They were actively worshiping, making a covenant renewal to the Lord. Their lives were in somewhat of a passive state. Okay, and Nehemiah was bringing some revival. The walls of Jerusalem were broken down. They weren't paying their tithes and offerings. They actually made room eventually for an enemy of God who was staying somewhere at the temple of the Lord where tithes and offerings were supposed to be stored. Of course, they were tithing grain and things like that. They were very passive as far as that and going against God's will. They also were not faithful in keeping the Sabbath. They were intermingling with the nations, those unbelievers. So their response to God was not in worship. But then here you have this time of revival, and they began to make this covenant with the Lord. Worship. Are we here to worship today? Do you worship the Lord every day? When it gets down to it, really everything we do is an act of worship. Everything we do is a response to the Lord. And then he says, you love me, you put me first, do everything for my sake. But then he says, love your neighbor as yourself. So really everything we do is a response to the Lord. And when it gets down to it, it is all, in essence, worship. Giving God His worth. Our whole life should be that of worship. Amen? So Daniel chapter 3 is all about worship. That's why I wanted to talk about worship. There's so many things that we could talk about, but hopefully that helped a bit. And we'll see that the three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their faith, their worship was alive and well. Remember what happened in Daniel chapter 2? A quick summary. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, right? This multi-mineral man. It was a dream that revealed the kingdoms that were going to rise and fall from the time of Babylon all the way to the God's everlasting kingdom. And, the dream revealed that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would not last forever. There was going to be another kingdom following him. So how did he respond to that dream? He rejected it. And that's where we get in chapter 3. Sometime later, he set up not this multi-mineral man, but he set up a man that was all of gold on the plain of Dura. And then he called all the leaders to come together to bow down in worship. In essence, this was forced worship. Is that true worship? Can worship be forced? Can it be fabricated? Not at all. So this was all about worship. For Nebuchadnezzar, it was all about worshiping him and his kingdom that he had set up, right? He was God, in essence. The Caesar of Rome was God. That's why he required worship back in his day. And Nebuchadnezzar here was forcing his subjects of his kingdom to worship and to give their allegiance to him. And this would pose a major problem for the commandment-keeping Jewish captives. Interesting note, how many of you like Bible archaeology? I love this. Archaeology, and they get some excavations 3 miles south of ancient Babylon near the river Dura as it joins the Euphrates have uncovered a platform that was 19 and a half feet high, 16 and a half square yards in surface. So they reckon that it could well have served to support the statue that we read about here in Daniel chapter 3. It's pretty interesting. And that the Arabic name of the site is Tolul Dura. And it reflects or echoes what we just read in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1 earlier, that this image of gold was set up in the plain of Dura. So kind of fascinating, I think. All right, so on the heels of Nebuchadnezzar's command to worship the image, that's what he was requiring, right, of everybody. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right, their non-compliance. Certain Chaldeans, what did they do? They called them out. They went to tell on the three guys. They went straight to the boss. They went straight to the king. They were made to stand before the king, and they were given one more chance to submit and bow down before the image. And how did they respond? What does it say here? Daniel 3 and verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. So what does this tell you here? Huh? They were confident, right? You know, their mind was, in essence, already made up. And Nebuchadnezzar should have already known this from Daniel chapter 1 and maybe Daniel chapter 2 as well, right? They would not be defiled by his bribery of food and drink. They would not be forced to bow in submission to something false, but they would remain allegiant and keep the commandments of God. And of course, bowing down to an image would be breaking the commandments of God. Verse 17, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. So with the crackling of the fire in the background, here we have this awesome demonstration of faith and trust in God. And if you can see it here, serving God is synonymous with worship of God. It all goes together. And finally, this is one of my favorite verses in Daniel to go along with Daniel 1 and verse 8, when Daniel made up his mind, determined his mind that he's not going to defile himself. They say in verse 18, but even if he does not deliver us, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Do you see any wavering here? Confidence? Not at all. There was no justifying, right, in order to get out of the situation. This was absolute trust and allegiance to their God. Right? Their mind was made up. Whether God was going to deliver them or not, their mind was made up. How did Nebuchadnezzar respond to that? Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered. What would that look like? Jeff, what would that face look like? Right? His whole countenance changed in response. And this Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath. I mean, this is a typical response of Satan, isn't it? When you read through the Bible, he was wroth with a woman. He was enraged with a woman. How did the King Herod respond when the Magi did not return to him? Right? So I want to worship the king. But then they didn't come back to him. The Lord said, don't come back. And what was Herod's response? He was enraged. So when Satan doesn't get his way, he becomes enraged. All right, to the point that his facial expression was altered. His whole countenance changed, right? He was raged. And then he ordered the furnace to be heated. And we got to read the text here. His facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated, right? This is the fire of all fires, the complete fire. If you think of number 7, verse 30, he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. But one thing they didn't realize, Nebuchadnezzar didn't realize, and those valiant warriors, is that they were casting these 3 into the presence of God. As we see, verse 22, for this reason, because of the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So what happened to those guards? Right, they were destroyed. What does this say about coming into God's presence? Right, the unrighteous cannot dwell in the presence of God. In this case here, at the end of time, when Jesus returns, the unrighteous cannot dwell in the presence of God. How do we become righteous? Through the blood of the Lamb, through Christ, by the power of His Spirit working in us, is the only way we can be declared righteous. It really has nothing to do with us and how good we are. So the unrighteous, in essence, the bottom line is that they did not accept the gift, right, of salvation. So these guards, right, thrown into God's presence. They could not stand. Verse 23, but these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the burning of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, was it not three men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? They replied to the king, certainly, O king. Yep. Verse 25, he said, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the fourth is like whom? Is like the son of the gods, he says. We know it was the son of God, but in Babylon, how many gods did they have? They had many, so maybe he just recognized it as the son of the gods. But we know it was the son of God. Verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. What do you notice about Nebuchadnezzar here? You notice that he came near the fire? So why wasn't he destroyed like his guards? You know, one thing we'll come to find out in the book of Daniel is that it seems as though the Lord was drawing Nebuchadnezzar into his presence. When we go through Daniel chapter 4, it seems as though he went through a transformation and that he, in the end, would submit and actually worship the God of all gods, even though the other little gods are no gods at all, Paul would say. So he was not burned in the presence of God. And praise the Lord, even though we are unrighteous and unworthy ourselves, by God's gift of grace, we will be able to stand in his presence as well when he appears, when Christ appears. Finally, it says, 27, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. The Lord delivered them. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him. How are we delivered? When we put our trust in him, violating the king's command and yielding up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. So here we see a positive response from Nebuchadnezzar. He was a little enraged earlier, but here he's starting to come around. I guess we all kind of come around every once in a while, don't we? We kind of get put in check by something, and we come around. Thankful the Lord is merciful with all of us. Notice again that service and worship, again, are linked together. Service for God and worship are linked together, just as much as faith and trust and obedience. It all works together. They're not really separated. Romans 6:16 essentially says, we worship, what we obey. What we follow, we essentially are worshiping. Just to finish the story, 2 more verses. Verse 29, therefore I make a decree, Nebuchadnezzar says, that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn from limb to limb. Right? The human nature is still there. Right? And their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. So it sounds pretty cool, but where did Nebuchadnezzar go wrong here? Yeah, you can't force true worship either. You can't force false worship, obviously, but you cannot force true worship either. True worship cannot be forced. It cannot be manipulated. It can't be produced. It only comes from within, from the heart, as we respond to the Lord's goodness. Romans 2:24 says, the kindness of the Lord that leads to repentance. Can we force anybody in the church to repent? It only comes from the Lord, and it comes in response to his kindness and his grace. Anything that is forced is not true worship. The last verse says, then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. What does prosper mean? What does it look like? What does it mean to prosper? I think it's kind of relative, right, to what we worship. You know, it's subjective to your definition of what prospering might be, because we would say that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they prospered, they lived, God delivered. But does God deliver all from the flames of persecution? He doesn't. He had a greater purpose, so that's where the trust and faith comes in. I read a story from the historian Eusebius. He documented the fate of 3 faithful men in the days of the early church. Their names were Priscus, Malchus, and Alexander, right? They even have names recorded in history. They were thrown in the midst of wild animals. Okay, this was in Caesarea Maritima, and it was likely that they were placed in this hippodrome. What was a hippodrome? It was a horse race. It was a place for games. You could see all the seating around there, and maybe they had some storage and things there. So these 3 men, right, they became food for wild beasts. Where was God? Was he still there? We believe that he was still there, even though they weren't delivered in the same way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were, right? They became food for wild beasts because of their confession. John was on the island of Patmos because of his confession, because of his faith, because of whom he worshiped. So these 3 men, I mean, their testimony still stands today for us to talk here this morning. So God was there bringing, and that act of worship, that the worship of those 3 still bring glory to God's name today. And it can strengthen the church. And Eusebius did note when I read up on it that the men actually first acted cowardly. Okay, but in the end, they took a stand for Christ. And they paid the ultimate price. How many times have we failed on our walks in taking a stand for Christ? So we can relate with these 3 guys. At first they weren't so sure, but in the end they made the decision, right? And they were counted worthy to suffer for Christ, as it says in the book of Acts, in chapter 5. So worship. Hopefully we get an idea of worship today, and an example of worship that we find in Daniel 3. It's not just a children's story that we've read 1,000 times, thrown into the fiery furnace. It is an example of worship for us today, and it is the central point in Daniel chapter 3. And at the end of time, what's going to be the issue? It's going to come down to worship. When you talk about the mark of the beast and the seal of God, this end time scenario, it's going to be about worship. And the worship can't be right in that moment leading up to the issue of the mark of the beast and the seal of God. Right? We're going to have to be prepared before that point exactly comes. And Daniel chapter 3 actually becomes a foundation for understanding the mark of the beast. And we're not going to talk about that today. Just to read 2 quick verses before we close. It says in Revelation 13:14, and he, this is the second beast. Who is the second beast of Revelation 13? It is the United States. We can study that. It says, and he deceives those who dwell. He deceives, right? That's the way Satan works. He deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast. This is the first beast. Who is the first beast? Babel, Rome, exactly. Telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast. Okay, here's this idea of an image being set up. And it's going to talk about worship here in a moment. It says, they'll make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. Okay, so it's not a literal image like it is in Daniel chapter 3, but it's going to be something that is in the image or reflects that of this first beast of Rome. So it has to be connected to Rome. And finally it says in verse 15, it says, and it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Either you worship, you bow down and worship whatever that image might be, which means you are giving it its worth when you act in obedience to it, or in this case, you are threatened on the pain of death. So what will you do when your life is on the line? To whatever degree. What about just the day-to-day, when your faith is challenged, even to the smallest nth degree? Right, and giving your whole life to Christ. Will you take a stand for Christ in those moments, in those small moments? What does the Bible say? He who was faithful in the little will be faithful in much. Have you taken a stand for Christ in everything that you do at every moment? Because I think as we've established, everything we do in essence is an act of worship. So what will you do, if the Lord calls you to pay the ultimate cost of walking the walk, as Jesus did unto death? What will you do if your life is threatened? Will you continue to take a stand for God? Right? The one who is worthy of our worship. He's not asking us to do anything that He hasn't done. Or will you bow in submission in order to save your own head? So the time is now to be right with the Lord and to connect with Him, to worship Him every day. If we're not doing it now, we won't be ready. We believe something like this, or this scenario, is coming. So if we're not right with the Lord now, how are we going to take a stand then? So let's worship the Lord together with all of our hearts, with all of our soul, with all of our might. Amen. He is worthy of our worship.